an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
Well, here we go, folks. It is the 26th day of July. The final Friday of the month this year. And it's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And we're going to take a bit of a hiatus through the next 4 weeks. Not the kind of hiatus they've taken at Queen's Park, mind you, but just a bit of a breather. And, we'll be back in September to kick things off just before the Liberals have their gathering. I think it's on the 20th of September. That's the weekend, and they're in London. So Keith Leslie is here, and John Wright, per usual, co-hosts here on The Ledge. And so before we get started, I just want to kind of roll back to the last show we did 2 weeks ago.
I know exactly where you're going.
And,
where John was wrong?
And
oh, wait a second.
Wait. Just wait. Here we go.
I don't know how it's going to actually resolve itself, but the government's going to have to cave. Let's bet here. By Wednesday, we're going to see movement on this. By Wednesday.
Okay, well, he wasn't far off. It was the Friday morning, and we had significant movement. But your point was that the government caved, and I saw your note minutes after the bottles were back on the shelves and the LCB was open. You were convincing Keith and I that the government failed and the union won.
Well, I think where my error in judgment, if you could put it that way, was that I thought that there would be more of a publicity around the fact that in fact, the government had given in to the unions. So I think it depends on how you look at this. I'm going to go back. I'm not just defending my position. First of all, it was Wednesday when there was movement on this.
They said they're going back to the table. You're right.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was Wednesday. But look at the deal. Notwithstanding the fact that the union demands to have pay for the time that it's out. Now, teachers, there has been precedent made for that, but they asked for it. They got kicked in the face for it. But the reality is that you look at what the deal was. And so instead of 7% at the table, they got 8%. They get 1,000 employees who are made permanent. They get a whole bunch of other guarantees and other things done. Okay, so I think the next part of what I said was, do you know of any union in this province who's failed to get what it wants at the table? So it depends on how you want to position this. I'm not going to say that the government publicly was called out. It won its case where what's the victory in this? It gets to go ahead and give a whole bunch of liquor to corner stores that otherwise, there may have been an impediment on what the union had. But if you look at the deal, I don't think that the union lost. If you figure out that that's what their goal is to go to the table and get something for their members. If they lost, they had some out-of-pocket costs for being out on strike. But who cares for the union members, whether they do or not? It's what you get in your pocket at the end of the day. And I think it's a pretty good deal.
I think they're going to need some more of those LCBO workers to be on the job. Just, Keith, to restock the shelves. I was in there yesterday, and just for curiosity, as opposed to necessarily having to pick up anything we really needed. But the shelves are really kind of empty, and I thought, that was their parting shot before they went out on strike. The hell with you. Fuck it. I'm not going to put any work in on these last 2 days. We know we're not going out. But here's the issue. And I don't disagree necessarily with John, but in the background, I'm thinking, I never felt that the government at any point was saying what they're asking for is unreasonable, except around the mixed drinks in the convenience store. So the government won that day. They got what they wanted there. My sense is that whatever they put on the table and on all the details that John's outlined, we're going to be on the table at the end of the day anyway. So the government already had that baked into the plan.
Well, that was my position couple of weeks ago, was that the union drawing the line in the sand on the ready-to-mix drinks, or RTDs as they call them, ready-to-drink cocktails, pre-mixed cocktails, that was a mistake for the union. And the movement on the Wednesday that John talks about, where the talks were going to resume, they resumed after Ford said That ship has sailed. It's halfway across Lake Ontario. We're not backing down. You're not setting policy on the ready-to-drink cocktails, which are spirit-based, which is why the union wanted to, they said they should have exclusive rights at the LCBO to sell any spirit-based products, even though these ones are convenient by their nature and they're sort of kind of belong in convenience stores. It's a tough argument. That was my mistake, my position. The union's mistake was, going on strike. To Dave's point, I think that this 8% could have been had. The initial offer was 7%. It was initially 400 casual jobs would become permanent casual or permanent part-time. And it's 1,000. I think those were on the table in the first place. The government really didn't like that RTD thing, and the union pushed for a strike on an issue I didn't think was necessary. They'd never had a strike in their 97-year history. There's a new leader of OPSEU who seemed determined to go to strike against the Ford government to make some kind of point. The union, you say, benefited its members. It got them a nice raise. It got more members onto less casual basis, more permanent part-time. But they didn't get the permanent full-time jobs. I mean, they should have been able to get, push for 1,000 of those. They got 60 at the warehouse. But they did get a strong commitment from Ford, to keep LCBO stores going. And in fact, he said this week, once the strike was over and everything was back, that he pointed to St. Thomas and said, Volkswagen's building this massive, factory down there for, batteries, for car batteries. And, we're going to open a new LCBO store there. So he's literally showing them, we are not trying to dismantle the retail outlets of the LCBO, but we're determined as a government to open it up to more retail outlets. And, you can survive the competition or not. So I think the government, in the end, I don't think there was much pressure at all on the government during the 2-week shutdown of the stores, other than perhaps from the restaurant and bar industry, which were indeed getting pushed to the ropes. And any longer for them at the crucial peak summer months, I think the Ford government would have been on the rope. But they planning this out with the 2-week shutdown off the bat, everyone was warned about it. I think was the government, again, this just went according to plan for them.
I would also throw into that how the union presented their argument from a communications point of view through this entire thing was so badly managed. I mean, it was the premise, as you rightly said, it was amateurish, going in from the very beginning, and how it communicated and what it communicated to the public. I mean, we're here to defend the free enterprise. The LCBO, which transfers all this money over to the government for all kinds of other services. Like, I got to explain that. And when you're explaining all of that, you're losing the argument. I just thought the whole thing was, the whole strike from the union side was just botched from a communications point of view. And I think I agree with you. There was some hardship behind the scenes for a number of the local restaurants and industry like that. But, being able to order this stuff from the warehouse and having it delivered, and even some of the private, if you stepped out of Toronto, you had private stores who have the licenses, and there was the ability to stock the shelves there. It was just a really dumb positioning for the union, which ultimately, as I say, they ended up getting a good deal at the end of the day. May not have been what they wanted to, but the reality is that that the government got through this in a really good way.
But the other side of this is it opened our eyes, I think, to the idea that there are alternatives out there, and that people were more likely to embrace this idea of expanding the access to alcohol purchases and so on. And John, I think there were more people saying, oh, I can do that, who never would have engaged in this conversation before this had happened. So on that side of the messaging, I think the Ford government actually won. Doug Ford's, interactive map aside, I walked into the dressing room of the rink, a couple weeks ago. Hey, I got this guy who he imports wine from British Columbia, so it's really good stuff. And there was this whole kind of underground network all of a sudden going on of where can I get this stuff? And hey, it's pretty good stuff, and I don't need the LCBO. Or I had talked to somebody who said, well, shit, I just ordered online and I got it from the LCBO. They delivered it 3 days later.
Yeah, no, I think this was the first and last strike that we'll see, because, again, I would be able to walk down 3 blocks from my house and go into a wine rack, which is directly across the street from the LCBO. And it was stocked with a whole bunch of wine and things that I could simply pull off for, between $14 and $19 for a bottle of Cabernet and bring it home, rather than, go across the street and try and go through the LCBO and find it. So, I mean, What's really interesting to me here is that by going on strike, what's happened is you've expanded the awareness of where to get liquor elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And as a result, you've taken away your leverage if you ever want to do it again, and especially if it's going to be in corner stores or convenience stores. So I think it's the first and last, and there we go.
The other side of this is, and they were reporting in the Star this week, and David Coletto at Abacus has been doing some polling for the Star, and he found that just in the wake of it, the Ford approval ratings were up like 44%, Keith, and it's like that's spiked up higher than it was at some points in the pandemic. So this, politically, he can say got her done, and he's got some wind under his wings.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's the kind of thing, as we say, the Liberals, David Peterson, first promised 39 years ago. And we're at the point where people are said, there's 670, I think it is 680 LCBO stores, very fine stores, good retail outlets. How'd you like to have 10,000 places you can go pick up your bottle of wine or your 6-pack, your 12-pack, your 2-4? 10,000, maybe 12,000 more places. Yeah, I think I'm on board with that. Again, no disrespect at all to the LCBO stores. They're really good. We've spoken before. I think they're a top-notch retail experience. They have really good product knowledge, and their stores are wonderful. Their magazine is fantastic. All those things. But 10,000 stores versus 670 across the province? I mean, it's a province of 14, 15 million people. It just makes sense. And it's the modernization. It's the kind of thing we see all across Canada. I remember going to a convention in British Columbia in the early 1990s, 1991, and the hotel had a drive-through beer store, and no one thought twice about it. Now, unlike Texas, you weren't allowed to pop one as your way out through the drive-through. You were supposed to keep them sealed till you got home, but it was like this is 30 odd years ago, a drive-through beer store, and no one. I think you get wine as well, and no one panicked. Mm-hmm. It just was. So this is. I think the government really long behind the government catching up. And to John's point, Doug Ford gets to claim credit for it.
Yeah, and Summer's back on the rails, and, he doesn't have to be so awkward at flipping burgers to make his point. But, it's interesting to see, how people responded to that. And to your point, John, I think you're right. That's probably it. The LCBO had their last shot, and away you go. The only other thing is, and again, anecdotal, I kind of came around to this recently when the independent grocer at the end of our street started, adding just beer to the shelves. And again, I never would have thought of it as being an issue, but okay, I guess I can just pick up my 6-pack of Keith's right here, whatever it might be. And it was simpler and easier because we knew we were having somebody coming over for a barbecue or whatever. And again, I think that it's elevated the conversation to the point of finally we're engaged in it. And, just generally speaking, I think that's probably what that 44%, that bump represents. Okay, good. I'm good with that.
Well, to Doug Ford's point, if you are at the liquor store to get a bottle of whiskey or a nice bottle of scotch or whatever you're looking for, and you do want some ready to mix or ready to drink cocktails as well, you're not going to then leave the LCBO and go to a convenience store to get them. Right. You're going to pick them up while you're at the LCBO.
Cuts both ways. Yeah, exactly.
So it does work both ways. And I think there'll always be a large, as long as they keep the spirits in large bottles to the LCBO, there'll always be LCBO retail. Now, Doug Ford's emphasizing very much that the province makes that $2.5 billion from wholesaling booze, not necessarily from the retail branches. That's very minimal. It can be made up in other areas. So, and we know as well that the Loblaws, Shoppers, the big box stores, they're all pushing they're lobbying now to have the right to sell bottles of spirits, and they're going to continue to push that. So will we see that evolve? I think the LCBO union has a very valid concern there, but I also think in time, Ontarians are going to say, well, if I can pick up a 2-4 at the Costco, why can't I get one of those great big bottles of whiskey that they sell for a little bit cheaper? Mm-hmm. And I think it's just going to evolve to that. Despite the concerns of the LCBO and the union attempt to draw the line in the sand at spirits, I think that line is just fading away.
We're 14 and a half minutes into this discussion this morning, and I just want to point something out that it doesn't necessarily have to do with any of the content that we actually talk about. But I recently had somebody reach out to us, and they wanted to get involved. They wanted to find out whether or not we have sponsors on this show. And if you listen to it on various platforms, you'll hear ads that are inserted into this show from time to time. And that's done because we have a hosting platform that does it for us. So it piqued a conversation around, what would it be like to get involved and so on. Anyway, I dipped into the numbers on the back end on this show. This is episode 266 since you and I started it, John, back in 2018. And for those of you who are just joining us, it doesn't sound like a lot over 5 years, only because the show typically only runs when the legislature's sitting. So anyway, I looked at all of those shows, and we are able to dig in and see what the retention rate is. So for those of you who are listening right now, it's highly likely, on average, you listen to about 92% of every episode you listen to.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you hang in for 15 minutes.
I've got a big family.
Yeah. Well, I discounted your crew, John.
Yeah.
But it just strikes me as it's, kind of an interesting way. So then what I did was I went and figured out the length of each episode, took the average, and in the last 10 episodes that we put out there, the audience has spent I'm trying to think now. It's a crazy number. If you actually figure it all out, the number of minutes that they spend with us in a given 10-day period, we're up to almost like years. We can count the number, the amount of time that people spend on this show. So given that this is our break before we come back in the fall, thank you for hanging in, because this was a real revelation to me this week. And people will say, well, what kind of audience do we have? And I am able to say we have an audience that's really engaged, and they, you guys listen, we get feedback from you, you spread the show around. So thanks for doing that. And I expect that you've all got a thought or two on what happened at the LCBO. So I would encourage you, if you've got feedback for us, by all means, you can find me on X at Dave Trafford. I know John and Keith are both active on X. What's your handle on X, Keith?
Queen's Park Newsboy.
Queen's Park Newsboy, and at John Wright, right?
Yeah, John Wright Live.
John Wright Live. So feel free to hit us up with ideas, thoughts, or otherwise, argue with us, because sometimes, well, not often, we're not wrong. So
John can be.
But we'll defend your right to be wrong any day. That's how it works. Okay, before we came on here, Keith, you were in the middle of a breathless rant about traffic. John, you kind of took off and talked about how crazy and awful it was to get around town here in the city of Toronto. And my guess is that anybody beyond the GTA couldn't give a rat's rectum about our problems around this. But just to bring you up to date, the province has coughed up another $73 million, to speed up construction on the Gardiner Expressway. For those of you who don't understand the geography, that is the highway that runs along parallel to the Lakeshore in and out of Toronto, east-west. And it was supposed to take 3 years. Now they've put the money in. It's going to take 2 years, but it still means we're going to have the construction at least up until the spring of 2026. So and I had to laugh. I read Ed Keenan's article in the Star, and he said, "Well, if you got loved ones stuck on the Gardiner, it means they're going to be home in time for the World Cup." So yes. It's just the way this is all kind of played out. But he made a really interesting point. Two things. All we did was bitch about, or all we did was pat ourselves on the back over the last 30 years of how much money we saved. But that's because we didn't spend it on infrastructure or maintenance. And then when we do finally spend it on infrastructure and maintenance, we do it all at once. And it's just, bringing the city to a crawl, because all of these routes that would be alternatives, Keith, are all under construction. It's all a mess. So I don't know if, I guess I understand that we need to do it. It just seems to be such a source of complaint and a source of anger, outrage, to the point where people are moving out of the city or threatening to, businesses and otherwise. This the diminishing return here, $73 million notwithstanding, is becoming a difficult issue to deal with, because at the end of this, and our friends at the Toronto Region Board of Trade will tell you this is all about productivity. It's not just about filling potholes.
Well, does productivity go down if your commute time is up by 250%?
Right.
because I'm pretty sure that's a serious hit to anybody getting anywhere or even thinking, I'm not coming back in here. I've been visiting Toronto every month, May, June, July. July I was there. I've been there twice this month, once for 11 days, another for a week. So I'm spending a lot of time in Toronto. And unlike most of my more recent visits since I moved out of the city, this one, it's people who live in Toronto who are complaining to me, you can't get anywhere. Everything's being done at once. It's not me being, the expat saying, gee, Toronto's changed. No, I'm saying nothing. I'm riding around on the TTC and doing my best to get where I'm going. And it's pretty good. Didn't have any bad experiences. But the people who are trying to move around, especially if you have to use a car anywhere, it's just insane. And the way they're talking about it is, as you say, it's a frustration level of why do they have to do everything at once? We can't move. We can't get anywhere. And I'm fed up with this. So to hear that from people who I know live and love in Toronto, they want to stay here. They want to be here. It's concerning because everyone is feeling this. And as you say, well, it's only another couple years maybe for the garden. And then what about the next section of the garden that needs doing? Because it's going to need, as opposed to burying the whole thing, which is another whole debate. What I got most out of the day when the flooding shut down the Don Valley and the Lakeshore was when we saw the waves going across Lakeshore Boulevard, little waves going across Lakeshore Boulevard with cars on it. That's when a couple days later, of course, Doug Ford's own family home flooded, the basement flooded. But when seeing Lakeshore Boulevard flooded, the Premier was asked, how can you go ahead with plans to build this underground parking garage at the Therme Spa at Ontario Place? Underwater, underground, virtually underwater. The Lakeshore is already underwater. And Ford really, he read the room right away on that one. He just said, it cost so much to build underground. We were hoping we could build maybe higher, but without blocking the view, go up instead of going underground. And then in the end, he sort of coughed up. He said, stay tuned and maybe it'll go across the street.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to that. But I mean, the idea here that back to the Gardiner and the Don Valley Parkway, that was the ribbon for Mayor Chow as soon as she came out of the last election. And a year ago she was all excited, John, because now we've got the deal where the province we've uploaded the maintenance and everything of these two highways to the province. That only works if they're actually willing to do two things. First, invest the money that's needed to do it properly, but secondly, coordinate with the city of Toronto. So it might be actually a more complicated process than we originally thought, even though it's going to save the city hundreds of millions of dollars in capital spending.
I think we're experiencing the greatest crisis that this city has seen in decades. I can't remember a time when the options not to live in this city have been either so prosecuted that you can work from home, you can live where you want, you don't have to go downtown if you choose not to. We have 20 to 25% of the commercial space in the city is wide open. You have a huge condo glut, basically made up of condos that no one would buy. I mean, $1.3 million for a 762 square foot condo with paper thin walls. I mean, and then pile on top of that. So you've got Gardiner Expressway clog, but then the interior streets, not only are they clogged because all of this is going on all at once, but with the streetscaping that's taking place, it's basically squeezing out cars, and it's putting in place kind of a pedestrian city, a European pedestrian city, which we're hollowing out the core. So where are the people going to be who's going to, work and be in that same core? Like we can't fill the condos that we've got now. So I look at this and say that we have a plan for cities like this that have disengaged from the reality of collecting commercial revenue and having people in the city doing work. If you're going to squeeze out all these people because of all of this stuff, they'll find alternatives, much like the LCBO strike. They'll just do something else. You're going to get young people say there's no point living in this city at all. Can't get around except, I can come in and I can go to the odd restaurant now and again. But I'm not on a rant. I think there's a problem across this country. I was talking to a colleague in Vancouver yesterday. It's exactly the same thing. And they have a lot of homeless people down there and nobody really wants to go down at certain times, but the downtown core is now being hollowed out. And I look to the United States and I see places like St. Louis, and I could name a whole bunch of other cities which have been hollowed out and they have not come back. And I think this is the greater concern. You're doing all of this streetscaping and all of this stuff at the cost of people just saying, I'm not going down there anymore. I flew into the island the other day. I couldn't get an Uber. Not off the island. It was easier for me to actually sit in traffic for half an hour in a shuttle bus to go to the Royal York. And then it took me 17 minutes to get an Uber that was in distance over by the CBC building, I think it was, to come down and pick me up there. You can't operate in a city like this and think it's going to attract new investment, to attract new employees, to attract new companies, to attract people to come to the city. Because at the end of the day, they're now talking about the rain tax being levied on commercial outlets. That's what's being talked about here. So I think there's got to be a reset in our society. And it may, I was actually out of the city as well just recently to, I'd say, a semi-rural area. The amount that houses are being sold for out there are like, they're starting at 860,000 and moving into the 1.4 million range, where you would have bought it maybe for 4.5, before the pandemic. And it's happening in the United States where the costs are the same now. I think there's now 231 cities where there were 78 before the pandemic that are now $1 million or more for a house. I think this needs a rethink and a reset, because what's happening here is you're spreading people outside of the core, which means that it's just going to be hollowed out for either a bunch of people who can afford to live here, a bunch of elderly people who need daycare for themselves at a certain point in their life, home care, daycare, people visiting, and hospitals. But I don't know how it's going to attract the revenue you need for all of this. Does it mean that the province then keeps bailing you out all the time because you're not going to have the source? I don't know. I think we haven't had a reset in a post-pandemic world. I think we're still living by the 2019 handbook, and it's going to go right off the rails. I think there's going to be, anyways, I'll just leave it at that. I don't think there's been an attempt to kind of bring together provincial, federal, or municipal people in a room saying, what the hell are we dealing with? Like, how are we going to structure this so people can actually populate our cities, give us the tax revenue we want, and actually make it livable? Because I don't think it's headed in that direction.
Well, I think that this is everybody talks about the New Deal with the province in Toronto, Keith, and this is splashed around the province in various locations and so on, and the strong mayor and so on. I'm still of the belief that a lot of this has to be driven by Queen's Park. I mean, we need that oversight, because there is just so much ambiguity and inconsistency around the stuff John's talking about that gets caught up in councils. We were, before we were coming on, we were just talking about how some of the neighborhood improvement projects just kind of pop up, and all of a sudden you're wondering, well, how much did it cost? Why was the money spent there? It's because the decision was made in some subcommittee room at town council, and that's how these things are happening. And I don't necessarily want to get down too far in the weeds on terms of what the province's role should be, but there needs to be more consistency in that kind of stuff as far as planning is concerned and housing. I mean, they're trying to do it with quotas in terms of housing starts, etc., but it needs to go much further.
They couldn't even agree as a province to implement, the fourplex housing law. So looking for provincial guidance where it's clearly needed in so many of these areas. Obviously, infrastructure is one of them. I mean, councils, it should be something like NATO, where you're required to set aside a certain percentage of your GDP, of your budget, to deal with your infrastructure. And, it should be exponentially increased depending on the number of bridges you have in your community, how much water, all these sorts of things, right? I mean, it's so much easier for short-term councils to just, deal with the short-term issues that they have to deal with. And then, of course, we're talking about these little neighborhood improvement things and streetscaping that John raises and stuff. A lot of these come from pools of money that most of us have no idea exist. If you're not a town councillor or perhaps one of their staffers, as you say, talking about this at a subcommittee meeting, and all of a sudden a little thing in the middle of a road where we're going to put a few trees and a planter and maybe a bench, and it's $800,000 and $900,000. Money that perhaps the community would have rather seen spent elsewhere, perhaps to alleviate the homeless encampments. And I think, again, this is just another, every time I think of the homeless issue, I think of the province needing to take the lead on this, because it's such a social welfare issue. And municipalities just don't have the money or the resources or the staff to deal. It needs provincial leadership. We need the word they always like to use is czar, but we need someone in charge of homelessness at the provincial level to help municipalities coordinate and deal with that. And the same with infrastructure and so many other things. You don't want the province dictating everything, but you do need some clear guidelines, some mandates from the province. As I say, just even a minimum amount of your budget that is set aside for infrastructure, because it's going to come home to roost. And probably not for you. It'll be the next council. But you know what? That's that short-sighted thinking by politicians is what's getting us into this huge infrastructure deficit we have now. And the fact that the Gardner alone needs billions of dollars. The Don Valley, that's been flooding since I moved into that neighborhood. We used to live at the top of the hill there where the baseball diamonds are. That's been flooding. That baseball diamond you could use maybe 3-4 weeks each summer because it floods all the time, and then it goes over the Bayview Extension, then it goes over the Don Valley, right over the road itself. Well, that's got to be raised. And at some point, well, how do you raise it when there's bridges over there? So all of this is going to cost billions and billions of dollars that's not being invested now, and it needs provincial leadership. The province apparently, even though they said they were uploading the DVP and the Gardner, hasn't actually officially done that yet.
No, they haven't. So if we get into this conversation then, and it kind of lends itself to what you already alluded to, and that's the Ontario Place circumstance. There we have a classic situation where Ontario Place is Ontario property, but there are areas around it that are owned by the city, and so on, and the exhibition, for example, right across the road, the CNE. Now we're into this whole idea that we can't put underground parking under Ontario Place, and you've already pointed out one of the main reasons why, Keith. That is, it will flood if we have more of this rain. And to be clear, we have had 3 heavy torrential rain episodes in the last 3 weeks. The worst one being the one you alluded to with the whitecaps on the Lakeshore Boulevard. But it's not that unusual to see that with heavy rains. So it was a devastating flood downtown, and we're talking about billions of dollars in insurance claims, et cetera, as a result of all this. Back to the idea, though, that they want to create this parking facility, which they are apparently legally required to do based on their agreement with Therme. Well, we'll just put it at the CNE grounds. But we can't put it underground because it's too expensive, so we want to have an above ground. And the folks at the CNE are saying, hold on a freaking minute here. We've already agreed that if you need parking, we'll put it here, but you're putting it underground. And we don't give a rat's ass that it's costing this much money. It's up to you to do this. Now the province is pressuring or going back on this whole deal around what they're going to do with the parking space at Ontario Place /CNE. And I can't understand how they can possibly figure or argue that the city should be kicking money in for that, John. I just don't get it.
I just find the government, I just sound like a broken record on this. I wish if they were listening to this, they'd even consider hiring me to go in there and help. Because the reason is, I always think this is retail decision making without a lot of planning and thought, even on the communications and stuff. It disappoints me as someone who used to work at Ontario Place and has that nostalgia about it. And let's give blame where it lands, and that is the Bob Rae government put in the Budweiser stage that sucked all the energy out of the forum, and then, you ended up having nobody go down for the rest of the place, blah, blah, blah. But this whole thing just smacks of deals that have been made in order to revitalize something that has, you're going to get opposition whatever you do on this, but to have the spa or whatever it's called named as it is with the lease that's put in place. The next thing is, well, okay, how are we going to accommodate people who go down there? And now you've got this kind of complicated issue with respect to a garage, let alone the fact that you were then committing to move all the exhibits and all of those other things from the Science Center, the logistics of it, the cost of it, all of that sort of stuff, rather than, putting the money into it to keep it alive, having starved it for so many years. Like, it just seems that there's no real planning to it. It's all decision making that's done on the fly. And I think, that phrase in politics about, they make decisions on the back of an envelope. I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that people sat in a room one day and said, we could do this and might go and do that. I mean, the story I tell, I worked with Don Cousins, who was a member of Parliament, and he was in the short-term Conservative government under Frank Miller before it fell. And one of the things that he was in correctional services, and I think it was up in the Bruce Power area. One of the things they wanted to kind of put a landmine under was if the Liberals took over, that they'd have some problems. And what we announced was a shrimp farm to be done off of Bruce Power that would bring in hundreds and hundreds of jobs. So that and we found a case in Israel where, in fact, they did that. And of course, it was announced, and there was all kinds of stuff. And of course, they had to undo it when they got back into power. But but it was one of those short-term. We can grab this from here. There's enough evidence for that. We can put this here, and there's hot water coming out from there, and we can have radioactive or half-baked shrimps or whatever you want to call it. But what I'm saying is, it's kind of like that, isn't it? Isn't it kind of like,
for sure. Everything's
like
half-baked.
You'd never run a company like this. You'd sit down and kind of go, how are we going to do this? And then should it be 99 years? Should it be 50 years? Should it be 35 years? How can we attract even local people who would want to do something with it? Like, you just sit down and go through this, when in fact it's kind of like, let's flip this, let's do this, let's do that, and let's communicate it this way without thinking it through in a kind of domino dropping way. And that's what causes me, concern about a lot of these deals. It's just not thought through.
Shouldn't the first question have been, should taxpayers be on the hook for a $600 million underground parking garage?
Whoops.
I'm jumping the gun.
Well,
it's actually an attraction now. You can go underwater at Ontario Place.
Get your car, seal.
But it's also a case, isn't it a case where it's also, it's that amount of money, but the municipality has to make a lot of these decisions. Like, if you don't have, you can go and take your own Ontario Place stuff, but you're not going to be able to do the amount of people that you need there to create that kind of, they're going to be across the bridge, right, on the other side. And you're going to have to then figure out how you can streetscape it, another term, to try and make sure that you've got the flow of the traffic and all that. Ontario Place has not seen traffic flows down there for some time. And if you're, it's clogged now, just think of what it's going to be then. But again, there's interconnectivity, there's politics, and that's why you get flip-flops all over the place, because it's just not thought through any more than the transactional nature of the politics and the decision-making at the time. Yeah,
and I guess the question, and there's a certain fatigue then that's baked into that, Keith, because we can rail on this or point out the inconsistency or what the hell were you thinking moment as much as you want, but it's back to, I can't get from fucking here to there without having to take a pack of lunch, and that's where it gets to. So that level of frustration leads to a level of disengagement to some degree. I don't care, just get it done, becomes the clarion call.
And that's this government's motto now, isn't it? Get it done. Let's get her done. They know people's level of frustration is at that point. And I think they were counting on people's level of frustration with the deteriorating condition of the Science Center being at the same point. Yeah, it's got to be gone. They're counting on this. They're counting on public support for for God's sakes, Ontario Place has been empty for a decade on the prime waterfront. Do something. Turn it into a park. It could have been dealt with at least on that level. No. We're going to go big scale. We need some details. We still need, the crucial point to me is we don't have any details on this 95-year lease to Therme Spa, which the Premier insists now on calling a water park, because that's what used to be at Ontario Place, was a water park. So perhaps it is a little bit about the language here, but the bottom line is we know none of the details. The only detail we know is that the province is on the hook to provide a parking garage for the spa that has a 95-year lease. And to your point, Dave, they're probably going to have to put it on city lands, which means another whole set of negotiations. These things just never go well. They don't. And so someone's going to end up buying land, swapping land, or who knows, maybe we can get part of the Science Center will be on both sides of Lakeshore Boulevard. Maybe part of it can be, attached to the roof of the parking garage. I don't know. But they're going to have to look at something. And we should point out that we've railed on before about the Science Center, the Friday afternoon when they put up the fences right around it and said, that's it, it's got to close, it's going to collapse. They did allow the wedding to go on the next day. CTV reported this week that the wedding that was scheduled for that day, they just said, don't believe what you're hearing in the media. There's no problem until the snow comes. So talk about undermining the government's case, which is, has been struggling to get out and get believed. Here they go ahead, they put the fences up one day and allow a wedding party into the damn Science Center the next day. So, From a PR move, another massive blunder as far as I can see.
But, does it really matter?
No, it does
Yeah,
not.
okay, so that's what I mean. I mean, from a political standpoint, we're talking about stuff that affect people in Toronto when, in fact, you can win on the skirts of the some of the ridings in the outer part of Toronto, and then for the rest of the province. So they're not experiencing. There's not many dinner tables in the Ottawa Valley that are talking about Therma Spa.
Well, there aren't many dinner tables in the Ottawa Valley that are talking or cheering for the Tories either. But
Well, no. Yeah. Well, maybe true for some of it. Well, yeah, Johnny Akabuski up there. So, I mean, it's got a foothold. And Cheryl Gallant, you can't write off either as a, But the reality is that outside of Toronto, that's where the gains are made for the Tory party, and their numbers are pretty good.
Well, how about here's one that we did. I know, Dave, you want to wrap it up, but I want to touch on Sylvia Jones, our favorite cabinet minister, deputy premier health minister this week, announced that the pharmacists were going to be given an increased scope of practice, diagnose a few more things, be able to treat a few more things.
Yep.
And absolutely refused repeated times, well, how much are we going to pay them? What's the difference? What's the cost of this program? No one's saying this is evil or wrong. We just want to know what the cost is. And she literally said, we're not here today to cover costs. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the whole goddamn point. What are the costs that we have to cover as taxpayers for this program? No one's saying it's wrong. No one's saying you're not going to help shorten the list. And she just repeatedly refused. And it was
stunning.
Beyond arrogant.
Exactly.
Just insulting.
Well, here's what's worse.
Just fees or to cover. My God, we're here to whatever. You're having a media availability. That means the media dictate the issue, not you.
Yeah.
Yes, and they even ask on-topic questions. The on-topic questions are, what's it bloody cost?
And staff saying next question.
Yeah.
Right.
Just insanity. I mean, it's a big program. We already know that the deal is, it isn't that the pharmacists might make more money. It's that the pharmacy owners,
company.
shoppers, the corporations, they made tens of millions of dollars off the med check, where they get $75 a call to go, if you've got 3 or more medications, they phone you up and do this. A doctor gets paid $40 to do that in his office or her office. So, we just want to know, what are you paying the pharmacist for this thing? And can't get that. That's disgraceful. It's as bad as the not knowing in detail of the 95-year thermal lease. But this one actually applies to all of Ontario. Everyone should be concerned about this because it's more privatization, money going to private healthcare. And they won't even tell us how much. Just tell us.
Well, I had to laugh, though. Then somebody floated a question towards the deputy premier, by the way, asking about Ontario Place, and she just outright refused even to address the notion that she should somehow have an answer for them. I mean, she's the freaking deputy premier. Everything should be on the table for her. It's not just about what's going on in the health ministry.
Well, I think she's wise enough to know they didn't brief me on that. I'm not answering.
Well, if that's the case.
That I'm pretty sure is the case. And that's my point.
Entirely.
It's ridiculous. Yeah. This is the worst performing minister left in both positions as health minister and deputy premier, despite a shuffle where we all, quite frankly, expected she would be moved along. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And should have.
Just before we go, watching what's going on in Jasper, and last year we talked about what happened in Nova Scotia and the various forest fires, et cetera, and how bad they are. Just keep in mind, folks, that in the next few days when you're out and it's a little hazy and you take a deep breath, part of that is Jasper Park that you're breathing in. And we have done a lot of work at Story Studio Network in the forestry sector. And this is, I'll put it in the show notes because there was a LinkedIn post that was written by a guy that we've had on the show before. His name is Jamie Stephen. And if you want to understand how fragile the forests are, read what he's talking about. And our biggest mistake is that forest management and policymakers, now there are people who are committed to it otherwise, but they think, we got to save the forests, so we just let them stand. We don't cut them, we don't harvest them, we don't kind of go in and prune the trees and all that kind of stuff. You just make sure that we preserve the forest, and that's a mistake. We need smart forest management, and that there are ways in which, if we properly do it, it not only mitigates it. Jamie Stephen, and I'll put this link in the show notes for you to read. He will tell you that if you do it right, there's a carbon capture technology that you could do using wood that wouldn't otherwise be used, would otherwise go up in smoke and create carbon, that it not only mitigates the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, if you do it right, over a period of time, you begin to reduce the carbon emissions. So you reverse climate change. That there are lots of things on the agenda around climate and everything else, but the degree to which we willfully ignore this as a resource and a tool politically is shameful. And it's easy to ignore because most of us live in urban areas. The bush is over there. And if a record number of hectares of forest burn every year, we don't notice it except on some smoky day in southern Ontario or in
Nova Scotia, it wasn't just forests, was it? It was neighborhoods, and we got the bill yesterday, $500 million in insurance claims.
Yeah,
for a few dozen homes. I think it was less than 3 dozen homes, but properties, and it's stunning how quickly and how fast it happens. And again, this was not a particularly, this was very close to Halifax. This was not far away. Not a big rural area at all. Yeah. Yes, there were trees around, but it's not that far from a major city.
Well, the way it was described to me, it would be like Don Mills in Toronto.
Yeah. It just wasn't that far away. Yeah.
Like that, it was a suburban area that was nicely treed in a green neighborhood, but that's what we're talking about here. So when we see the pictures of Jasper, and I talked to one of the guys who works in the park. He's a forest management guy in the park, and he talked about the beetles, infestation of beetles in the pine. And he said as soon as they dry out, they become tinder. So to hear that Jasper was where it was only a matter of time. And his point was we needed to go in and cut down all of that stuff, and you just can't keep up with it because we don't have the forward thinking. I mean, you apply the infrastructure argument here in Ontario, right across the country, we're seeing the same kind of thing. So, the degree to which we invest in and pay attention to our forests is going to be really instrumental in what we do about climate change and our CO2 emissions and getting to net zero. So here we are. It is Friday, and I just figured now that everything's back to somewhat normal, we'll just pour one here for everybody, and that'll do it for us. So we'll talk to you guys in a month or so. So enjoy your August. Keith Leslie, John Wright, and for those of you who have hung in that long, that drink's for you. School's out.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.